Hi everyone. Just a little late tonight. Not too much, I don't think. Took a little longer than I anticipated to get ready. I hope everything is okay at your end, and I hope you can see and hear okay. Hi Dolores. Hi Greg Mallard. Hi Bonnie, and hi Cheyenne. Thank you for coming. Please share. I think I'd like to wait for a minute or two for a few more people to arrive. In the meantime, here's to you. And here's to Bernie. He had a good one last night. So, the alternative media, and I suspect ourselves, are persuaded that Bernie has won and that Warren did pretty well. Hi, Lana. But that the debate was sadly lacking in certain particulars. And everybody points, of course, to the asking of the question about your friends. Who are the friends that are most important to you and what you learned, or something like that? So they spent 15 minutes on that and 0 minutes on climate change out of 3 hours. It was a terrible performance by CNN and their plutocratic moderators. The problem with CNN is that they have a political debate and they put the debate in the hands of the millionaires and then claim that they're unbiased. Well, I'm afraid not. I'm afraid they're not unbiased. But Bernie cleaned up. He cleaned up at the debate itself, and he cleaned up yesterday in contributions also, getting a huge amount, of donations. I think he probably caught up to his pace, of last month. He had dropped back a little due to his illness, I think. But the campaign has been pressing for days now. And I think that they have caught up and are very happy with where they are at this point. So I think that's good. Now, why do I think the campaign is heating up at this point? Because I think Joe Biden has taken another serious hit. And I think we're going to see him slip in the polls still further because really everybody can see there's no comparison between Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders and Warren in terms of sheer competence. And it's hard for people to draw any other conclusions. So, in spite of all the propaganda that's going to be arrayed to support him, I see Warren as gaining further on Joe Biden, and I see Bernie as surging now in terms of his campaign. And I suspect that we're going to see things radically change. The CPU usage is quite high. I don't know why. But I'm going to get rid of one of my items here and see if that makes a difference. I'm going to see if that's had any effect at all. Not so you notice it. How are my visuals and my sound? Is everything all right out there? Yeah, big Bernie rally in Queens. I know about that. Hi, Amber Lee. Hiya, Jeff. How you doing this evening? So I think things are looking better for Bernie, and we're going to see him start to gain here. I think the endorsements by AOC and Rashida, okay, and Ilhan Omar are all very exciting. And the video that Ilhan Omar released is is really a great piece of work, I think. And I'm sure the rally on Saturday uh, is really going to be very exciting and very motivating for the campaign. Okay, and I think that Bernie's criticisms of Biden, but during the debate, were very well taken, and it finally happened. I mean, people were waiting for him to actually critique Joe Biden, and he did, and he did a good job of it in a short time. He could have been little better, as many people, okay, are pointing out, but still, it was a powerful critique, and I think it helped to push Biden over the edge. I think now he's probably hanging by his fingertips. I think you saw the mainstream trying to prop up some of the alternatives they like, specifically Buttigieg, who they seem to like. For me, he has zero charisma, but I don't know. They seem to think that he's got a lot of that. And also, I think that they decided to give Amy Klobuchar a shot to see if lightning would strike for her. I personally think she landed with a great big thud. Very negative. We just can't do very much for you, and that's because we're responsible and clear thinking people who know about all the barriers. We're practical, and we just want to tell you there is no hope. There is no hope. All we can promise you is this little band aid or that little band aid, because that's all that's practical. Of course, We don't want to hear about what's practical. We want to hear about what the candidates are going to try to solve, the real problems they're going to try to solve, and how they're going to try to solve them. Harsh Med is joined. Hi, Harsh Med. How are you? And so, uh, I think that Klobuchar was a big failure. Now, the people in the spin room, the mainstream press commentators, felt a little different about the whole thing than the alternative media did. They think that Amy Klobuchar did a good job and viewed her as the moderate hitting back. They thought that Pete actually did a good job also. And they, of course, were also backing Warren to some degree, but it's obvious that even though they will settle for Warren if they have to, they don't really want Warren. They would feel much more comfortable supporting a Klobuchar or somebody like that. In other words, somebody who would be real horrible for the rest of us. But unfortunately, she too has the charisma of a flea. In fact, her charisma is probably negative. She probably has the charisma of a black widow spider. So there it is. So, as Cenk Uygur said today, well, our views are different from your views about who won the debates. And we just got to see who's right. So we just got to see what happens with the polling. Now, of course, there is a little bit wrong with that because the mainstream is going to try to fix the polls as much as they can. And you know how they do that. They skew the polls towards the older demographic. They skew the polls towards the party people alone. They skew the polls towards those people who are more likely to go for Joe Biden or for Buttigieg, okay, or for Amy Klobuchar. And they know how to do that. So the polls are not an entirely objective test. But even though they keep trying to do that, they haven't stopped the rise of Warren in the polls. They haven't been able to completely knock out Bernie Sanders, who seems to be rising again in the polls. And they don't seem to be able to control the outcome of their own polls. And among the pollsters who are less biased and who are more honest, of course, we see that Bernie is doing better among them, but Tulsi is doing a little better among them, and Warren is really surging among them. Okay, so I just wanted to say I expect, based on his performance in the debate, based on the endorsements afterwards, based on the rallies that are going to occur in just a few days, that Bernie is really going to start to surge again, and we're going to see the emergence of a two-person race. It's going to be Bernie, okay, and Warren in the two-person race. And I think we're also going to see Andrew Yang start to gain ground, because I don't think that Bernie and Warren have yet knocked the legs out of the basic income notion. And I think there's support coming from the progressive left for the idea of a basic income. I think if we want to cut the legs out from under Andrew Yang, which I think is pretty important because I think deep down Andrew Yang is a neoliberal. Not so deep down. I don't even think you have to scratch the surface too much. I think in some ways Andrew Yang is a Buttigieg with a gimmick that sounds good to people who are progressive and who long for the day when everybody will be able to do what they want to do, and there'll still be plenty to go around because our productivity is so high. Greg says he's a tech libertarian. Yes, he is a tech libertarian. Okay, but he seems like he's a left libertarian because he wants to give $1,000 a month to people. Well, I think here we know a lot of the objections to that, but the way to cut the legs out from under it, as I said in my last stream, is to do a synthesis of federal job guarantee and a living wage. And I think Bernie had better start forgetting $15 an hour and start going to an average of $20 an hour, cost adjusted across the country, because that's going to be much closer to a living wage. And I think that they should be combining that with a basic income for those who need it. As for those who owe large debts, Bernie's already going to forgive student debts. They're already going to be gone. I think what Bernie also has to do is to develop a program for forgiveness of debt for those who were victimized by the crisis of 2008. I think he's already got some things in his program for that. And he's also got to move on to get rid, of credit card debt. Because the justification is that much of the credit card debt we have here in this country has been produced by unconscionable interest rates that were introduced by the neoliberals during the 80s, the 90s, and since the turn of the century. It was produced by the political power of the bank lobbies and by the credit card lobbies. Yeah, of course, he's agreed. He has in his program, he has provisions in his program, but for the forgiveness, of medical debt, and I've covered that here, in previous live streams as well. But he has to move on to credit card debt because a lot of that debt was incurred through the injustices that came out of the politics of the past. It's going to be great if Bernie can reduce the credit card interest rates to what they should have been in the first place, something like perhaps a maximum of 6% over prime. But on top of that, he's got to erase the past by relieving the people who are suffering from the credit card debt. And also, Tanet correctly makes clear, credit card debt is also caused by low wages, lost jobs, and the high cost of housing. Yes, it's also been caused by the injustices of the past. So Bernie has to remove the injustices for the future. Okay, but in addition, uh, he needs to do even more in his program to heal the injustices that have been done to people over the last 20 to 30 years. So I think that's important as well. So let us leave that and let us go to some things that have been happening around the world. I want to go first to here in the United States, an article in Common Dreams, which I'll share now. If you'll bear with me. Title of this article is the media outlets used the study of a healthcare plan that is not Sanders' Medicare for All bill to fearmonger the cost of Medicare for All. So what happened? A new study was released by the Urban Institute. Okay, this is an article, by the way, that was written by Jake Johnson, one of their staff writers here. We've covered a lot of his stuff here in the past. I'll put this on clearly now so you're not distracted by all kinds of fancy stuff. It was published today, October 16th. And, okay, the Urban Institute, which used to be left-leaning when it first started back in the 1970s, but which now is a neoliberal hothouse, released a comprehensive study, so-called. And the media outlets immediately seized upon it as evidence that the Medicare for All proposal authored by Bernie Sanders would increase total U.S. healthcare costs by $7 trillion over the next a decade. However, Matt Bruenig of the People's Policy Project has already pointed out that the Urban Institute assessed the cost of its own made-up version of single payer, not the bill that Bernie Sanders introduced in April. Oops. Quote, the Urban Plan uses hospital reimbursement rates that are 15% higher than the rates in the Medicare for All legislation, meaning that its cost estimates are much higher than the actual costs of Medicare for All, said Matt. Quote again, Urban is certainly welcome to put forward any health plans they can think of and score them to the best of their ability, but it is important for media and for us to understand that this is Urban's single-payer plan, not the Medicare for All plan supported by Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and many other congressional Democrats, unquote. And by the way, it's also not the Jayapal bill in the House, H.R. 1384. Remember, the Jayapal bill is going to be cheaper than the Bernie bill, if for no other reason than the Bernie bill in the Senate has a 4-year transition period, and the Jayapal bill in the House has only a 2-year transition period. So that alone will make the Bernie bill more expensive. Okay, so not only has Urban not costed out the Bernie bill, but it hasn't costed out the Jayapal bill, which is still more economical. Okay, so to go on with the article, if every major industrialized nation on earth can make healthcare right to all and achieve better healthcare outcomes while spending far less per person than we do, it is absurd to suggest that the United States of America cannot do the same, unquote, said Warren Gunnels, a senior advisor to Bernie Sanders and a very sharp guy. But apart from his being a very sharp guy, Urban has been displaying a neoliberal bias for many, many years, insisting that federal funding can only occur through taxing and borrowing, not recognizing at all the insights, okay, of MMT, and furthermore, often being in league with the Peterson Foundation, the center, okay, of neoliberalism, at least one of the major centers, okay, of neoliberalism, maybe the most well-funded one here in the United States, which, by the way, has been funding part of Urban's work. Okay, so Urban is a little better than the right-wing think tanks funded at George Mason by the Koch brothers. Okay. Their findings on these matters, in other words, are very untrustworthy. We have to consider the source. Many mainstream and corporate media outlets, however, did not heed Matt Bruenig's warning. On Wednesday morning, CNN, Axios, the Associated Press, the Washington Examiner, okay, and other outlets. And by the way, though I like Matt Bruenig, okay, a lot, we all have to note that one of his things is that he's not for the federal job guarantee, but he is for a basic income. So just sort of keep that in mind. He is for Medicare for all, though, certainly, as well, and is a strong Bernie Sanders supporter in that respect. On Wednesday morning, CNN, Axios, the Associated Press, the Washington Examiner, and other outlets published articles conflating the Urban Institute's contrived single-payer enhanced plan with Sanders' Medicare for All legislation. CNN's Tammy Luby reported that, quote, a new Urban Institute study shows the nation's overall healthcare spending is expected to rise $7 trillion to $59 trillion over a decade if Medicare for All goes into effect. Now, that is bullshit. Luby went on to claim that, quote, a big hike in taxes would be required to finance Medicare for All. The Washington Examiner, a right-wing publication, put the inflated $59 trillion figure in its headline, which also declared the analysis finds health spending would rise, not fall, under Medicare for All. So they've been looking for that. The right wing and the so-called centrists have been looking for a study like that for some time. But as Bruenig pointed out, quote, there are reports that have attempted to score Medicare for All as it is actually written, with the most prominent being the one produced by Charles Blehaus at the right-wing Mercatus Center last July. Yes, and you remember that one found that it would reduce national health expenditures by $2 trillion in its first 10 years. Now, that one was a right-wing study and biased against Medicare for All, which tried to distort its own findings to give the right wing a highlight to use against Medicare for All. But the study was biased in various ways anyway, and should not even be quoted, I don't think, by left-wing sources, though I suppose it's good to quote it in contrast to the even more biased study, which was just done by Urban, which is purportedly left-leaning, my butt. As Common Dreams reported, the media outlets effectively did the Mercatus Center's dirty work by blasting out its finding that Medicare for All would increase federal healthcare spending by $32.6 trillion while ignoring the $2 trillion in overall savings. Yes, that's what happened. A separate study published last November by researchers at the Political Economy Research Institute, that's the PERI group, up at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, estimated that Sanders' Medicare for All Act would have saved the U.S. $5.1 trillion over a decade while providing comprehensive health care to all. Warren Gunnels senior advisor to Sanders, told Common Dreams in response to the Urban Institute analysis that the United States currently spends over twice as much for health care as the average developed country. And more quotes from Gonals. If every major industrialized nation on earth can make health care, well, I guess I quoted that already, so I won't quote it again. And Robert Pollin, economics professor at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst and co-director of PRE, wrote in an open letter to Sanders earlier this month that he is confident that the net impact of Medicare for All based on your staff proposal will be to generate substantial savings in healthcare costs for most businesses and all but the most affluent of U.S. households. I'm going to not only endorse that even further, but I'm going to say that the PRE study was far too conservative. Far too conservative. All these studies are far too conservative because they try to estimate savings going from the bottom up. And when you do that, you ignore structural changes that will be introduced by Medicare for All taken as a whole. You ignore the difference in the climate surrounding healthcare that is created by the passage of that bill and by its implementation. It's going to change practices from the bottom up, and it's going to save far more money. Why do we know that? We know that because we can look at what Medicare for All bills have done, or similar programs have done, to Medicare for All in all the other major countries of the world that have similar programs. There is experience with this, empirical experience. We know that costs can be cut by a third. I don't know if they're going to be cut by a third in the first year. I doubt that because there's not an immediate transition. In the Jayapal bill, the transition is ended by the end of the second year. By the third year, those costs are going to be shooting down. Now let's consider what we're spending now, right now. We know our total healthcare costs for the United States are $3.8 trillion. Right now. 2/3 of that, which is a relatively conservative estimate as to what kinds of savings we might possibly get, 2/3 of that is roughly $2.5 trillion. Now, Steffi Woolhandler and David Himmelstein have costed out what current government expenditures are for health care in the United States at all levels, federal, state, and local. And they have found that we're already spending $2.5 trillion, right now. Now, if we had an immediate transition to Medicare for All, and we got the kinds of economies they have in other countries, such as Canada, we could cut costs by a third. Cost in the United States now, that $3.8 trillion, represents 18% of GDP spent on medical care. Canada only spends 11%. Their savings for Medicare for All are more than a third as a percentage of GDP. But if we can do even a third, the $2.5 trillion we're spending now would cover our Medicare for All costs. That is likely what we're going to start to see happen over the period of the transition period. And by the end of the transition period, we're very likely going to be there. So there is no way that we're going to be at 59 trillion or 57 trillion or even 50 trillion spending from a Medicare for All program. Even considering the transition period and the relatively slowly decreasing costs during the transition period, it seems to me, taking into account increases due to inflation, year by year increases, let's say 3% a year in costs. And by the way, we can make those costs increase by 3% per year. In other words, the federal government can budget that and control those costs and actually negotiate those costs with the private sector providers. With that kind of approach, we can ensure increases of 3% each year, but 3% after the cutbacks in costs due to the adoption, okay, of Medicare for All. In other words, in the first years, okay, of Medicare for All, our 3.8 trillion should fall to perhaps 3.4 trillion, then to 3.1 trillion, then to 3.3 trillion, at least in constant dollars. We're looking at something like 35, maybe 40 trillion a year, maybe 45 trillion a year, no larger than that. We are looking at savings of 13 to 20 trillion dollars from a Medicare for All plan. We are not looking at higher costs. The Urban Institute study is bullshit. It ignores what has happened in other countries around the world. It ignores that. How can you do a legitimate study without taking into account the experience of other nations that have implemented such a program? It's ridiculous. So don't take this seriously. Argue against it as best you can. Read the Urban Study, of course, but then, after you've read it, get into some of the details and realize that it's not using a more macroeconomic approach to costing. It's using a microeconomic approach to costing. It's making assumptions at each step of the microeconomic approach, and it's multiplying the errors of estimates it's making at each step of the job of doing cost estimation. That's why it comes out with such a grossly unintuitive view of what would happen over 10 years. So, I'm going to cut that off now and shift over to another article, quite important, that I wanted to briefly cover. This one is by Kevin Zeiss and Margaret Flowers, two of my favorite people on the left. And their article is called Pink Tide Against U.S. Domination Rising Again in Latin America. And this was published on October 14th. I've been saving it for a few days. So, this is a review of what's been happening in various countries, okay, in Latin America. Of course, you know that in the last number of years, perhaps 5 years or so, 6 years or so, the pink tide in Latin America has been receding as authoritarian regimes run by neoliberals have taken over government after government and have done deals with the IMF for loans from the IMF and have created a situation where their nations are under the thumb of international finance. The article points out after the embattled president of Ecuador claimed that President Nicolas Maduro was the cause of massive protests against him. President of Ecuador is Lenin Moreno, who used to be the vice president for Correa, Rafael Correa, but who has basically betrayed the revolution in Ecuador and has turned to the neoliberal side himself. Anyway, he blamed the Venezuelan president as the cause of the massive protests against him. However, Maduro said, quote, "We have two models in Latin America, the IMF model, which privatizes everything and takes away the people's rights to health, education, and work, and the humanist progressive model, which is emerging in Latin America and has the Bolivarian revolution at the forefront," unquote. So Maduro's clear understanding of the conflict is why it has been so important for the United States to remove him. His success in defeating ongoing U.S. coup attempts is a model guiding Latin America to a future independent of domination by the U.S. And here's a photo of Ecuadorians celebrating the repeal of Decree 883, which was promulgated by Moreno. On October 4th, he proclaimed the end of a 40-year policy of fuel and petrol subsidies, which had traditionally benefited his country's working-class population. He also announced a 20% decrease in the salary of public employees and initiated plans to privatize their pensions. He removed workplace and job security safeguards. Decree 883, known as, quote, the package, unquote, was a series of neoliberal policies demanded by the IMF in return for a $4.2 billion loan. It was preceded by policies for the wealthy, including reducing their taxes. The IMF loan was part of Moreno serving as a puppet and bowing to multiple U.S. demands. Ecuador promised to settle a long dispute with Chevron, whose oil drilling and pipelines have polluted the country. Tens of billions of dollars in restitution from Chevron are at stake. However, Moreno said he is willing to give them up. In fact, the IMF loan is strange and it was dependent on Ecuador paying external debt obligations, i.e., it was not new funds for Ecuador, but new debt to subsidize paying back Wall Street. In fact, if I recall correctly, much of it was for paying back a settlement that came out of an ISDS dispute that was pursued by Occidental Petroleum, who had a long-term lease, with Ecuador that Correa abrogated because it was not in the interests of the country. So he ended the lease. Chevron sued under a treaty, not Chevron, but Occidental, I believe, sued under a treaty it had with the United States that had an investor-state dispute settlement clause in it. And one of the corporate-run quasi-judicial courts granted something like $3.2 billion in fines to Occidental Petroleum, okay, because of what Ecuador had done. Okay, now Ecuador is a small country, and I previously computed that if Ecuador had been the size of the United States and had gotten a proportionately similar fine, okay, from an ISDS court, it would have imposed a fine of $250 billion on a nation the size of the United States, which would have had a considerable impact on our budget and caused all kinds of consternation in Congress, and we probably would never have paid such a fine either. But of course, Ecuador is a very small country, and when Moreno took over and went with the neoliberals, it was possible for the international community, international finance, to push Ecuador around, to deny them basically their sovereignty, and to try to force them to pay this fine. And one of the means they used was to get the government of Ecuador to accept this $4.2 billion loan, which was, of course, about to have a devastating effect, okay, on Ecuador, because Decree 883 was there to produce the austerity that the government felt was needed to come up with the money to make the payments on the $5.2 billion loan. Yes, the loan was a strange loan. It was not new funds for Ecuador, but new debt to subsidize paying back Wall Street. In this case, specifically, a lot of it was for Occidental Petroleum, if I recall correctly. Anyway, this is all detailed in my book on declarations of the dependence, and in my other Kindle book on who needs balanced budgets, who needs balanced trade. And both of these books discuss the incident with Occidental, again, if I recall correctly. In making the announcement, the president of Ecuador, Moreno, called the people zangados, quote unquote, or drone bees, leading to the uprising of the drone bees. Drone bees, sorry, not beads, bees. The mass protests were called by the Popular Front, a group of unions, and the Unified Workers' Federation of Indigenous Nationalities of Ecuador, CONE. Students and social movements joined protests throughout the nation, in Loja, in Guayaquil, in Cuenca, Ambato, and in Riobamba, among other cities, as well as Quito, the capital. And Moreno claimed without any evidence that the uprising was financed by Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and Hector Correa. The protests in Ecuador were relentless, with no end in sight. They grew when 20,000 indigenous people marched into Quito. Police responded with violence, tear gas, and mass arrests. An October 4th video circulated on social media showed 9 violent protesters killed in the street by the police, as well as other police violence. On October 5th, there was declared a 60-day state of emergency by Moreno. Sometimes police had to retreat in the face of mass protests. On October 7th, he fled the capital to hide in a Navy base 260 miles away in the conservative stronghold of Guayaquil. As we wrote this newsletter, unrest in Ecuador was escalating. On Saturday, the nation was put on military lockdown. Law enforcement attacked protesters with pellets and tear gas in the immediate vicinity of the National Assembly. By Sunday, Moreno decreed a 3 p.m. curfew, which people defied. Then, facing an emergency session in the National Assembly, Moreno backed down. Protesters celebrated when his government announced that Decree 883 had been repealed after 11 days of popular mobilizations. Peter Koenig describes a root cause of the problems. Quote, since January 2000, Ecuador's economy is 100% dollarized, compliments of the IMF, entirely controlled by the U.S. Treasury by force of an absolute veto. The other two fully dollarized Latin American countries are El Salvador and Panama. When they say dollarized, they mean the currency of those countries is the U.S. dollar. It's not a country currency. So, of course, these countries had their monetary sovereignty circumscribed by their use of a foreign currency. In the same way, the nations of the Eurozone have their monetary sovereignty compromised by their use of the euro, which to them, to each individual nation, is a foreign currency. The US and IMF used the economic crises of the 1990s to dollarize Ecuador's economy and gain full control over the riches of the nation, as Ecuador is the second largest oil economy in South America. This led to unaffordable goods for Ecuadorians, social unrest, and a series of unstable governments until President Correa, who served from 2007 to 2017, was elected. This is valuable history, I think, for those of you who don't know the situation down there. The Center for Economic and Policy Research 2017 report found under Correa, Ecuador did well with an average annual GDP growth of 1.5%, which doesn't sound like much, but it is, compared to a 0.6% average for the previous 26 years. Has produced a decline of 38% in poverty, with extreme poverty reduced by 47%, and a decline in inequality with the Gini coefficient falling substantially. Correa doubled social spending from 4.3% in 2006 to 8.6% in 2016, tripling education spending from 0.7% to 2.1%, and increasing public investments from 4% of GDP in 2006 to 10% of GDP in 2016. Correa served 3 terms. A 4th term would have required a constitutional amendment. Rather than running, Correa endorsed Lenin Moreno, who had served as his vice president from 2007 to 13. He was expected to continue Correa's policies, but instead he reversed them. He was unpopular before announcing the package due to structural poverty increasing from 23.1% in June 2017 to 25.5% in June 2019, with projections of 30% by the end of the year. Injustices like imprisonment of the popular former vice president, Jorge Glass, on dubious charges in his continuous witch hunt against Rafael Correa. I think I said Hector Correa earlier. I misspoke because I once had read a lot, about another Correa whose first name was Hector. Sorry. And other leaders of the by citizens by Revolution Party added to his unpopularity. In addition, he has been engulfed in a personal corruption crisis involving an offshore shell corporation, INA, which cast his presidency in doubt. Anyway, Moreno's forcible and illegal ejection of Julian Assange from the London Assembly in return for payoffs from the US and UK resulted in a national strike in Ecuador in July. This, along with the arrest of Ola Bini, who is being prosecuted falsely as a conspirator with WikiLeaks, was unpopular with the Ecuadorians. Will repeal of, quote, the package, unquote, end the protests and threat to his presidency? As we write, to answer to these questions are unclear. The people won a major victory, but the Moreno slash IMF infection remains. Indeed, it does. Next section is Latin Americans rising against the right and domination by the U.S. Latin American countries are rejecting neoliberalism and domination by the U.S. using multiple strategies to achieve change. This much, the deepening anti-capitalism movement in Bolivia is set to strengthen with the probable re-election of Evo Morales on October 20th. Argentina is expected to remove right-wing President Macri on October 27th and replace him with Alberto Fernandez. And Mexico put in place its first left-of-center government with the election of Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, AMLO, on July 1st of 2018. Okay. Also, elections are upcoming in by Uruguay on October 27th and in Peru in January. Venezuela may have National Assembly elections in January as well. Evo Morales has a 13-point lead in polls as his governing party, the Movement Towards Socialism, MAS, looks to re-election for a third term that will last until 2025. He has 38.8% of the vote, just 1.2% short of the 40% required for a first-round victory in the upcoming elections. The survey also indicated that there is majority support for the nationalization of gas and strategic industries. 51% say that public ownership is positive for the economy and social programs. 61.7% say they're essential for providing dignity to those of low incomes. Evo Morales has launched a large reforestation plan and put in place a model healthcare program. It should be noted, however, that his government has started fires in parts of the Amazon rainforest to clear land for commercial development. I don't know whether the fires have been put out as yet, but they were very large and very dangerous fires. And it's welcome to learn that he has a reforestation plan, as well. Anyway, he's under attack from the United States and other segments in his own country. And Morales leads an independent and sovereign Bolivia that has rejected the dominance of the U.S., decolonized and displaced neoliberalism. A recent color revolution attempt by the wealthy with the support of the U.S. and Western powers failed. Argentina's first round of voting on August 11th resulted in Fernandez running with former President Cristina Kirchner finishing 15% ahead of Macri. So Macri, I guess, came in third. The surprising landslide brought into question his ability to govern between now and the election. As a result, the IMF put a $5.4 billion loan on hold, part of the $56.3 billion standby agreement signed in mid-2018. Fernandez opposed the loan, which required sharp budget cuts affecting public services at a time of increasing poverty. Under Macri, the economy has gone into crisis, with poverty increasing to a record of 36.4%, a recession accompanied by a 47% inflation rate in 2018 and an inflation rate of 25.1% during the first 7 months of this year. So they've got stagflation, a stagnant economy with a huge inflation rate, producing increases in poverty, increasing poverty to a record of 36.4% from the neoliberal program that previously had borrowed money from the IMF and previously was operating under an austerity program provided by the IMF. As soon as Macri came in, he began to provide for the looting of the country by uh, the corporations, okay, by multinational corporations operating through the IMF. Poverty was at 19.7% when Kirchner left office in 2015. Fernandez has put forward an anti hunger plan not dependent on the IMF. 3 weeks before the election, thousands of people rallied in Buenos Aires as the Workers' Left Front sent a message of opposition to neoliberalism and austerity to the two major political parties. In Mexico, AMLO won a landslide 53% of the vote on July 31st, ending decades, okay, of right wing rule. AMLO hasn't been, though, as radical, okay, as hoped for. He promised a peaceful and radical transition with indigenous people as a priority for the government, okay, and government for the good of all, first the poor. His fight against neoliberalism is challenged by NAFTA 2, also known as the USMCA Treaty, which we are negotiating now, but which has not yet been approved. In other words, Trump has been trying to impose this treaty, as AMLO is careful not to confront Trump on this. On border policy, AMLO offered migrants a home in Mexico and urged investment in Central America. Now, the Zapatistas, representing the poor farmers, have conflicted with AMLO over the exploitation of resources and the use of the military and policing, demanding its autonomy based on indigenous principles, but he has sought diplomacy with them. AMLO has also faced massive strikes of tens of thousands of auto workers at U.S. companies in Mexico and wildcat strikes at the border. AMLO has been a counterweight to U.S. aggression in Latin America, standing with Venezuela and Cuba and but also Nicaragua. Peru is in the midst of a crisis, and the president, whose name is Martin Vizcarra, who came into office after a corruption scandal, removed his predecessor, dissolved the Congress, a move supported by the left because it's controlled by the far right politician Keiko Fujimori, and was preventing Vizcarra's anti-corruption campaign. Congress ignored the president's order and voted to remove him from office instead. The vice president resigned rather than take over, and Vizcarra remains in office with the support of the military. He's now called for new congressional elections to be held on January 26th. Vizcarra is a conservative who's battling the oligarchic right. The left, which has been deeply divided, is coalescing around the Popular National Assembly and allying with social movements. The movements want an end to neoliberal policies, a constituent assembly to draft a new constitution, and to break with the domination of Washington. In Central America, Honduras has been in revolt against the coup government of Juan Orlando Hernandez, JOH, which for 10 years has put in place the neoliberalism, repression, and violence. Protests have been ongoing since his coup and fraudulent re-election. This summer, protests intensified with a national strike over austerity and privatization measures required by an IMF loan, leading to a 66-day uprising. The U.S. has trained Honduran police to use repressive measures in an attempt to stop the protests, but their actions feed more protests. So many people have fled Honduras and have tried, of course, to come to the United States and to go to other places. Uh, I'm going to skip a little ahead, okay, to Brazil, and there's a review of the Bolsonaro situation, okay, the election there, the framing, okay, of Lula da Silva to stop him, okay, from running against the president. That is Jair Bolsonaro. In the secret exchanges, Mauro admitted that the corruption case was designed to frame Lula. Lula has said the U.S. is behind the conspiracy. The calls to free him are increasing, and the Supreme Court down there will be reviewing the case. Lula is demanding his record be cleared and refused a panicked offer from prosecutors that he be freed from jail and put under house arrest. Okay, Bolsonaro is also under attack for the Amazon fires, for an increase in police killings, for genocide against the indigenous peoples, and for attacks on public education. And the former president, the right-wing Michel Temer, acknowledged that the impeachment of former President Dilma Rousseff, the Workers' Party leader, was a coup d'etat. Okay. So Nicaragua, moving to that country, survived a 2018 U.S. coup attempt, and the revolution continues to thrive after 40 years of independence from domination by the U.S. after U.S.-backed dictator Anastasio Somoza fled. People were very confused about what happened in the 2018 coup attempt because misinformation by the media was prevalent. A group of us jointly produced a reader to help people understand the reality of Nicaragua. Peace is coming back to Nicaragua, even though continued pressure from the U.S. is expected in the form of new illegal sanctions. Sanctions, of course, are illegal according to international law and according to treaty, but it's expected that the Trump administration will impose the new legal sanctions, since it's been imposing illegal sanctions all over the world. Venezuela, which we have reported on intensively for years, has also survived ongoing coup attempts that continue to escalate in the post-John Bolton era of the Trump administration, most recently with the threat of war through the Organization of American States. Venezuela is prepared for a military attack and have created new alliances to overcome the U.S. economic war. This week, Russia announced it was investing $16.5 billion in Venezuela by the end of 2019. Russia has provided anti-missile defense systems, is keeping Navy ships in Venezuela and to deter a blockade by the U.S., and has helped gather intelligence on U.S. actions. With their help, Venezuela has uncovered terrorist plots coming from Colombia and involving U.S. puppet Juan Guaido's team. Guaido has faltered and failed time and again. Now is being investigated for ties to Colombian drug traffickers and corruption. So there's more. The Non-Aligned Movement, 120 nations met in Caracas this summer and expressed support for Venezuelan sovereignty. Venezuela has been a linchpin for left movements in Latin America. When oil prices were high, it shared its wealth, not only with the poorest Venezuelans, but with other countries seeking to challenge the U.S. and oligarch domination. Even in the midst of an escalating economic war with the United States, they continue to provide housing, food, and essentials to their people. They do. And then there's a Caribbean resistance. Cuba is challenged by the U.S. economic war, but continues its revolution. Mass protests in Haiti threaten the survival of the government, and Puerto Rico's revolt actually removed the governor. Cuba continues to be a bulwark against the imperialism of the U.S., standing with Venezuela, Nicaragua, when they are under attack. Cuba completed a successful transition to a new president, Juan Miguel Diaz Canel, and voted on a new constitution developed using a participatory process involving 9 million people, most of Cuba that means, through 133,000 citizen meetings. The Constitution includes universal and free health, education, sports and recreation, culture, and respect for human dignity. Cuba is currently facing major economic challenges as the U.S. is blocking their access to oil. Russia and Venezuela are helping Cuba overcome this oil blockade. Haiti's been in protest since April, and they review that. They review the Puerto Rican situation. I'm going to skip to the end now. But you can see that Central America and Latin America are in ferment against the domination of the United States. The point that I really wanted to make here and to drill into you is what change in the regime here in the United States to a Bernie Sanders presidency and a more progressive Congress would mean for Central America and for South America and for Latin America in general. The illegal sanctions would be gone. They would be ended by Bernie Sanders. The military interventions would be ended by Bernie Sanders. Most probably, entirely new trade relations would be established, which would not be exploitative, which would be governed by principles of fair trade or public purpose trade. The United States would end its imperialism throughout this particular hemisphere, strengthening our alliances with Latin American countries, making them real alliances of international friends dedicated to the prosperity of all, rather than keeping Latin America as basically a continent, more than a continent, of satellites of the U.S. being exploited by our multinational corporations. Bernie will stop all that and will collaborate with the pink tide of Latin America to totally change the situation and to stop the hostility of the people of Latin America towards the United States. There is an undercurrent of hostility now in nation after nation, because what the United States is doing is viewed as oppression of the people all throughout Latin America, not only in the Middle East, not only in many of the nations of Asia. We have to end the domination of international finance by the IMF, and we have to end the new imperialism which we have imposed on much of the world. It is terrible. It works against the people, causes suffering all over the world, and does nothing for the people of the United States. Our people do not benefit from any of this. It is against our national interests. It must be stopped. Okay, the next one, which I have to cover, I know it's late already, but I got to cover this one. This is an article written by Ron Jacobs, published on October 15th, called Betrayal in the Levant, and it was published in Counterpunch. And I remove the extraneous matter from the article. Here's a lovely picture of two Kurdish YPG fighters, obviously very young people. Confusion reigns in certain left-leaning and anarchist circles. Pat Robertson tells Trump he will lose his mandate of heaven if he really does pull the U.S. troops occupying northern Syria from their positions. Anyway, Democrats, Republicans, neocons, and neoliberals join the Pentagon and the mainstream of the U.S. media to decry this possible troop redeployment. Turkey assembles its military forces and moves into northern Syria. Some of its politicians tell their supporters they'll bury the Kurds in ditches along the roadside. Okay, Noam Chomsky supports the U.S. troops actually remaining in the area. What the hell is going on? Asks Ron Jacobs. What the Kurds in Rojava are attempting to do is a noble, if incredibly utopian attempt to create what their major theorist, Abdullah Öcalan, calls democratic confederalism. In his 2017 text, The Political Thought of Abdullah Öcalan, he describes this theory as a, quote, non state social paradigm not controlled by a state, unquote, decrying nationalism and nation states as creations and essential elements of capitalism. He calls instead for democratic autonomy. This situation is, quote, one that does not rely on separatism and violence and does not desire either the maximum power or capitalist economy that modern nation states require to exist. The text itself is a concise summary of O'Connell's thinking and development. The history of the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the organization he previously led, and the history of the Kurdish people. One key to this concept of democratic confederalism is that it rejects the duplication of existing hierarchies, whether those structures are of the state or the economy. Consequently, it rejects capitalism, nationalism in its currently understood sense, and the domination of the military. The implementation of this approach to governance is, as Callan writes, quote, predicated on finding a compromise with existing nation states, unquote. One assumes this is the arrangement that existed in northern Syria with both the Syrian government and the U.S. military. It is this understanding that most of the rest of the world either ignores or rejects. That misunderstanding causes Pat Robertson, Lindsey Graham, most Democrat and Republican legislators, and the Pentagon to see Trump's calls to move the U.S. troops out of the area as some kind of surrender to the desires of the government in Ankara. In actuality, it seems like Trump and the Trumpists believe others can take care of whatever business their vision of the U.S. needs to take care of in the region. Most likely, those others will be led by Israel and Saudi Arabia. Furthermore, U.S. forces will remain throughout the rest of the region. It is not likely they are packing up, going home, and destroying their weapons. Unfortunately, they can always be back to their dirty business in a moment's notice, says Jacobs. As for the idea floated by some who consider this troop reassignment, if it actually occurs, that is, to be a victory against imperialism, if only it were so. All that is required to reject this notion is to widen one's lens and look at the greater picture. Right now, a U.S. Navy strike group is stationed in the Persian Gulf. At least 100 U.S. Air Force warplanes are in the immediate region. Excuse me a moment here while I get back control of my cursor. And several thousand U.S. troops are bivouacked in different countries nearby. If one pulls that lens even further back, they would see that thousands of troops, sailors, and Marines are within a few hours or days from Syria and any other part of the Middle East. Considering this, it seems difficult to see this minor assignment as a victory. However, That doesn't mean that U.S. forces should remain there. In fact, it still means all U.S. forces should be pulled from the Middle East. Their presence is the cause of much of the current violence and human dislocation that defines the lives of way too many residents of the region. The other primary cause is the ongoing attempts of Israel to expand its borders in Washington's support of those attempts, while Trump has done little to convince mainstream pundits that he and his coterie of Trumpist advisors have an actual policy plan. Anyone seeing this as an anti war move must look at the big picture first. I wrote a piece back in 2004 entitled, quote, Are the Kurds in the Way? Unquote. I'm reprinting some of it here. During the last week of January 2004, Paul Bremer, who was the colonial overseer in Iraq, gave notice to another group of Kurds that the United States would begin operations against the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, a formerly Marxist, Leninist organization dedicated to armed struggle in the name of Kurdish independence. In terms of the public mission of the U.S. military in Iraq, there's no real reason for this move. Instead, this decision by the U.S. reflects a deal that Washington worked out with the government of Turkey, which has fought this organization and Kurdish independence since time immemorial. For those who are not familiar with the PKK, let me briefly summarize the history and political philosophy. In their over quarter century of existence, this group has waged a consistent struggle for a Kurdish homeland. Unlike the other two Kurdish parties, they are not on the CIA payroll and consider Turkey to be as great of an enemy of the Kurds as Iraq. Consequently, their primary struggle has been against the Turkish government which until recently forbid the teaching of the Kurdish language in predominantly Kurdish schools and has fostered an ultimately racist attitude on the part of the Turkish people against the Kurds. While it was originally a Marxist-Leninist economic and but philosophical nature, the PKK has modified its approach towards Kurdish by Kurdish liberation over the years. It continues to proclaim its desire for a just and democratic Kurdish land, either via some type of autonomous arrangement with other governments or through a true independent nation. But as noted previously, the Kurds being discussed in this piece are the political descendants of the PKK. The U.S. was presumably aware of this history and potential issues involved when it made the deal with the Kurds in northern Syria. Like Turkey, albeit on a different, lesser scale, Washington has no lasting interest in the survival of an autonomous, independent, and anti-capitalist district in the Middle East or anywhere else in the world. Or at least current Washington has no interest in this. Again, this may change if Bernie Sanders becomes the president. Likewise, the Rojava rebels must have understood this when they agreed to the arrangement they made with the U.S. forces occupying northern Syria. Like many marriages of convenience, neither party could have honestly thought it would be forever. Any organization born in struggle enters any agreement with greater powers knowing that wariness is a key element in its implementation. Given this, the projected removal of U.S. troops from northern Syria is not the end of the Kurdish struggle. It is a betrayal, but is no different from any other betrayal in Washington's long history of betrayal. Why do you think the line, quote, white man speak with forked tongue, unquote, supposedly said in relation to another broken treaty between Washington and a betrayed indigenous nation, exists? Whether or not this was ever spoken by the Native American, it was attributed to. The fact that it is part of the common parlance makes it clear that Washington's policy has always included betrayal. Furthermore, those who demand that the troops remain demand a no-fly zone or some other type of military intervention are not only supporting U.S. imperial policy, they're ultimately denying the Kurds their own agency, and by portraying them as victims who need U.S. support, they're diminishing their struggle. To be blunt, it reeks of arrogance and also paternalism. So, okay, what he is saying is that it's going to be up to the Kurds to gain their independence or their autonomy in any way they can. If they get a more friendly government here in the United States, it may be easier. They may be buffered against slaughter while they try to construct some kind of autonomous region. If the autonomous region is like the one, okay, in northern Syria, is confederal, is democratic, is socialistic with a small s, not in the context, okay, of a nation state, perhaps the Kurds will be able to live in peace with their neighbors who want to deny them a state. In other words, the type of regime they've had, okay, in northern Syria, in that uh, small area, okay, limited area, has been very interesting because it ultimately might prove to be something of a solution. Because their confederal area doesn't really threaten a government. It may be possible to work out a live and let live policy in Syria, which can spread also to Iraq and perhaps to parts of Iran. But I think before it spreads to Turkey, it's going to be a long, long time. Though a friendly government in the United States can certainly encourage this. But that's a long term solution, I think, for the Kurds. It may even be one the Israelis might support because I think Israel would like to see a Kurdistan that is relatively independent, carved out of four nations that might otherwise be hostile to it. Okay, so I thought I'd cover that for the history and for the background, okay, it gives, and for the perspective it gives, which is a very, very interesting one, I think. There was one thing I really wanted to cover, which I didn't cover, but I'm going to check in with you now and find out what your thoughts are and see if you have any tolerance for further facts and analysis and commentary tonight. Let me shift back to a larger view of myself. Let me take a look at what's going on Facebook right now. I see some of you are still here. In fact, you just even increased by two people. Hi, Sunday. Hi, Susan. Hi, Rob. How are you? And Evelina Pontus here. Which Kurd group has allied with the Syrian military to fight the Turks? It's the Syrian Kurds in the northeastern part, okay, of Syria. In other words, the Rojavan Kurds are the ones who set up the autonomous region in Syria, in Rojava, the Confederate Kurds. And Rob says, you're really smashing back that wine. I don't think so. That's about 1 ounce of wine. I kind of nursed that, actually. Okay, I'm going back further. To early Okay, so we are. So Greg points out we also need to scrap the credit score ratings, which place many in poverty. Yeah, we do. What we need to do is to localize lending so that the loan officers get to administer the loans, and through personal contacts with people in their local area over a period of time, they get to know who they can trust, and they rely more on more detailed evaluations of people who want loans in order to describe whether they are creditworthy, okay, or not. And loans also should be evaluated uh, if they're business loans. They should be evaluated based on the potential of the business, and the ability to repay should be evaluated from that standpoint, not from the standpoint of the wealth of the people who are borrowing. Robin Halsey had joined, but this was, of course, some time ago. I'm now just going through the comments. So Tanet says, side note, Joe, at the end, do you believe Bernie should be introducing people to MMT? I think he had enough on his plate. No, I don't believe he should be trying to introduce people to MMT right now, because the static from the mainstream, from the media, would be so strong, he would not be able to overcome it. Not during the campaign. The mainstream would go absolutely hysterical. So this has to be sub rosa. It has to be introduced in the way that people like AOC and Stephanie and Bernie have been introducing it over a period of time. What our job is our job is to continue to educate wider and wider circles of people, okay, of activist people, so that they know, okay, what MMT is, and they know what the potential is if we get people in office who look at things from an MMT perspective. If we can spread this widely enough and educate people sufficiently widely about this, then it can become a criterion for many thousands of people, even for hundreds of thousands of people who vote and who can be critical, okay, in certain elections, to begin to select candidates who are progressive based on whether they have at least an elementary understanding, okay, of MMT. I'm not saying that should be the only test, but a certain openness to MMT ideas has to be introduced by us, by activists such as ourselves, into the broader community, so that they're not susceptible to the old fiscal responsibility doctrine, to the appeals by the centrists, to the idea that funding for needed federal projects is somehow limited. No, that funding is not limited. It is limited only by the danger of inflation. It is not limited by taxing and borrowing in itself. Robin asks Tanet, or she addresses Tanet, that privilege of using credit reporting to get a job initiated with jobs related to money than as usual. It was usurped and used to filter applicants of other jobs. No government intervention, SMDH. So, yes, that's true, and that's going to be banned by the Bernie bill. Uh, Okay, Bernie has a plan to ban that and has already released that plan. Ernest Jones joined, my daughter Devorah joined, and Rob Rivera joined. And Rob says, "Hey Yoda, how's it going?" Tanette says again, "Why can't we frame Medicare for all as a public purpose necessity, like the military that but creates millions of great paying, fulfilling, important jobs, showing that the doctors, dentists, and nurses and such even bigger patriots who are on the front lines." Well, I think Bernie is trying to frame it as a matter, okay, of public purpose. I think he's framing it, okay, as an elementary right, okay, of citizens of the United States and of people, okay, who live here, as well as, okay, of citizens. He's framing it, okay, as a human right. And those people who are fulfilling the human rights of others or defending those rights uh, are patriots, and they are patriots who are on the front lines of ensuring that this very important right to health care is defended, okay, and is protected. So, yes, they are heroes, and we need to give them that kind of recognition every day. Rob says, "Still, I can't believe it. AOC and Ilhan endorses Bernie. I have to admit, I'm still in a state of bliss. I gotta pop champagne to this." No, I was sure AOC was going to endorse Bernie, and that Ilhan was going to endorse Bernie, and that Rashida was going to endorse Bernie. Tell you the truth, I'm waiting for Presley to endorse Bernie. I believe the only reason why she hasn't is because her senator is Elizabeth Warren. And politically, they're probably close in that particular state. So I don't know whether she's going to endorse Bernie, but I think she's inclined to go where the rest of the squad goes. Jim Bird joined, and Matt Waldy joined. Hi, Matt. And Tenant Landon says, "They have no rules, regulations. The people are at their mercy. I truly think they're corrupt. Not to mention that they lost millions of people's personal data, accounts, SS numbers, then want to charge us to watch our accounts that they put at risk. They should have been fined for losing those accounts, and fined heavily enough that it affected each of them on a personal basis, not just the corporations involved. They endangered us all with their carelessness, and now they've made the results of their carelessness a profit center for themselves. Those banks ought to be broken up." According to Kyle from Secular Talk, yeah, Kyle Kulinski, he said that AOC called Bernie when he was in the hospital to tell him she's going to endorse him. The reason why Ilhan endorses Bernie was because of his foreign policy. She doesn't trust Warren. Yep, I don't blame her for not trusting Warren, and I don't blame her for trusting Bernie. He's always been in the corner of American Muslims. Always, always, always. He supports Israel, all right, but not so much the kind of Israel we have now. The kind of Israel that there used to be before the neoliberal right wingers, nationalists, bastards took over Israel. Robin Halsey, wow, that's a lot to absorb. Hope Dr. Joe puts all that about Ecuador, Assange, IMF, and other Central American countries in a nutshell. I don't know that I put it in a nutshell or not. What I tried to do was to relate it for you to what a Bernie Sanders presidency could possibly mean for all the people down there and for the future of the Americas. It's big. It's big. Hi there, Evelina. And Rob says, you're really smashing back the line. Well, as I said, it was about an ounce, and I still got some of it left, at least a little. Rob says, hey, Yoda, what is your opinion of Marxist economists? I'm curious in what your personal perspective is on them. And this isn't just talking about The Ignorant by Rick Wolf. My personal perspective on it, and this dates back from close study during the 1950s, okay, and the 1960s, is that the Marxist economists that actually prevailed back then were people with a doctrine that was largely flawed. I mean, even the doctrine of class. Sometimes class is very difficult to measure. That was supposed to be scientific socialism, but the way they were using that concept of class wasn't even scientific. It was strictly an ideological use of class. Now, the consensus among the Marxist economists started to break down during the 1960s when there was a return on the part of many people to the humanist side, of Marxism. People found some of the early manuscripts of Marx and Engels. I think it was of Marx actually, primarily. The economic, and philosophical uh, uh, but specifically those manuscripts. And that was published and was pushed by people like who were not economists, like Eric Fromm, the psychoanalyst, and by other Marxists who weren't necessarily classically trained Marxists, but who read more and more widely and read other perspectives into Marx. And now, it seems to me, we have really a diverse set of people who say they are Marxists. I'm not sure what they hold in common. For example, I'm not sure what Rick Wolf, who says he's a Marxist, has in common with Michael Hudson, who also says he's a Marxist, and by the way, an MMTer, as well. I mean, he says he's an MMTer. I'm not sure all the MMTers consider him, an MMTer, but he self-identifies as both an MMTer, and a Marxist economist. But generally speaking, the modern Marxist economists who are around today are a much more diverse group. They have to be judged, as individuals. Sometimes the quality of their thinking is very, very high, very, very insightful. I think that some of what Rick Wolf has to say is very insightful, when it comes to cooperatives and those kinds of things. I listen to Rick Wolf. I listen critically to Rick Wolf, but I don't at all dismiss him. And there are many other people who consider themselves to be Marxists, worth reading and worth actually listening to. And there are many people in Western Europe, who are Marxists, but not in the classical communist mode, at all. So I think that Marxism is another world out there, and that there are many diverse schools of Marxist thought. Okay, at this point. Okay, and I'm not an expert. Okay, on Marxism. Okay, at all, but that's the impression. Okay, I have. And if someone okay is identified by someone else okay as a Marxist, I don't really take that but too seriously. I still want to see what the person has to say if it seems that person uh, is thought to be saying some interesting things. But Evelina says, which Kurd group has allied and answered that question already? Susan Eldridge has waved. And Rob Rivera says, I've watched some clips of last night's debate, and I'm shocked at just how pro war the Democratic candidates are and how pro war the media frames foreign policies. Yeah, me too. I interpret the media presents foreign policy topics in terms of the U.S. Uh, and this moral arbiter and action the U.S. decides to do is because of national security, keeping America safe, and making sure we are the heroes. That is so much nonsense. I mean, I agree that that's the justification always. It's the rationalization for what we do on national security and the national interest, okay, of the U.S. This comes out of the Chicago School of the 1930s, 40s, okay, and 50s. I know the thinking very well. Henry Kissinger belonged to that school, and many of our foreign policy advisors come out of the realist school of thinking with respect to foreign policy that looks at everything from the standpoint, okay, of the national interest of the United States, though nobody exactly knows how to define the national interest, okay, of the United States. It's a very loose label. It's an ideological label that's used to justify whatever the government of the United States is doing at a particular time. What Bernie Sanders thinks is the national security of the United States and what he thinks is the national interest of the United States is far different from what Donald Trump thinks the national interest of the United States and national security of the United States is, and far from what is seen by Obama to be the national security, okay, and the national interest of the United States. So one has to look past the slogans and has to look at what people are advocating, and one has to advocate for, has to evaluate for oneself whether what they're advocating for is actually in the national interest of the United States, or essentially what I like to say, what is consistent with the public purpose of the United States. If the Kurds had a Kurdistan again, would that settle a lot of issues in Syria? No, I'm not sure it would settle a lot of issues in Syria because some of the issues in Syria were being caused by jihadis from Sunni Islam. In other words, Syria was a pretty secular area. Okay, the Alawites, okay, that were running Syria are a fairly secular sect, okay, of people that tried to keep the country secularized in order to keep the country together, okay, because the religious divisions could be could be extremely divisive. In other words, the divisions between Sunni Arabs, okay, and the Shia population, okay, of Syria, could be very devastating for Syria. So the Assads and the Alawites had tried to build a secular society in Syria for some time and was successful in many respects. So What really needs to be done to settle the issues inside of Syria is to try to return to the situation they had before and treat that as an evolutionary situation, okay, and not a revolutionary situation, and try to keep the country evolving, okay, in an economic sense, so that it could become increasingly democratic and could serve as a buffer between Iran, okay, and the Sunni Arabs. So I think that's what we should have been doing in Syria. We definitely should not have been putting our troops in there. That was a great big mistake. Did the other squad members know MMT? I think they have a little bit of a familiarity with it and some friendliness to it. I don't think that they necessarily have the same interest, okay, in economics, okay, as AOC does. But they have a strong interest in economic and social justice. Dr. Joe, have you seen and heard Ron Paul and his latest attack on socialism and Bernie via a new book? His spin, but it makes me want to puke. No, I haven't seen this. I don't have much respect for Ron Paul as a philosopher. Okay, I never have had. His philosophy, of course, is extremely individualistic. In some ways, he's a nice man. He was strong on civil liberties. But if anybody took his advice, okay, on economics, they were crazy. And I don't think his son is really any better. So Susan says Presley has been working with Sandy Darity and Derek Hamilton on baby bonds, and probably on the job guarantee also, Susan. Because I don't think you can work with Sandy Darity, okay, and Derek Hamilton, okay, on baby bonds and stay away from the JG. I don't see that ever happening. Too bad Presley didn't endorse Bernie. Well, she still may endorse Bernie. Presley said she's not going to endorse anyone. That's because she's getting pulled between Bernie, okay, and Warren, as I surmised. And Steve says, hey there, Dr. Joe. And Rob says, the only Marxist I respect is Michael Hudson, just because he knows MMT. Otherwise, I take no interest. Well, you have to take the individuals as they come, Rob. In other words, just because somebody says they're a Marxist doesn't mean there's something terribly wrong with their thinking. You have to take the articles and the pieces of work and the books as they come. I guarantee sometime during the next 10 years, a Marxist is going to write an outstanding, okay, an important book. I'm not ready to tell you how many of such books, okay, are going to be written, but I'm pretty sure there's going to be at least one. Steve says, whatever was in the interest of Rome, same thing. Rob says, you think the intelligence agencies are going to threaten Bernie? What I mean is, if Bernie doesn't comply with what the agenda is of the CIA, then will they dig up dirt on him and blackmail him, or have leakers throughout and just cause chaos within his administration, internally, okay, and externally? I don't know if I can answer that, Rob. I mean, a lot is going to depend on how clever Bernie is at imposing controls on the CIA. Okay. In other words, what I mean by this is that it's it is traditional for the heads of the intelligence agencies to offer up their resignations when a new president comes in. That's going to happen again. Bernie is going to be able to appoint the heads of those agencies. He's going to be able to put his own people in there. So it's going to depend on who he puts in there, how well they know the agencies, and how well they'll be able to anticipate what is going to be done by the old hands to try to oppose what Bernie is doing. It may happen that some people in the CIA are going to oppose him, in various ways. It may be that he'll move to reduce the power of the CIA by reducing their appropriations and trying to shift some of that power to other agencies that he has closer control over. May do the same thing with the NSA. May do the same thing with the DIA. There's going to be a struggle within the intelligence agencies for control when Bernie comes in. There's no question about that. We don't know how that is going to work out. We know there are lots of military people who want to change things, and they can become reliable allies, of Bernie, who want to restore the subordination of the military and the intelligence agencies according to the Constitution of the United States. There are many, many military people who take seriously their oath to the Constitution of the United States and the tradition of civilian control of the military and the intelligence agencies. That's not something to be sneered at. There are a lot of people in the intelligence agencies who believe strongly in that. And I think Bernie will find that he can deal with them. Susan says a lot of people are asking her to endorse Bernie. Yeah, she's going to have a lot of pressure to endorse Bernie. But as long as Warren is also running a very strong campaign, and it's neck and neck, between she, and Bernie, then she's got a struggle on her hands. It won't be obvious who she ought to endorse. But her endorsement is not as important as AOC's endorsement. Of the four, AOC's endorsement is the most important. But Omar and Rashida are also endorsed, are also very important. I think that, yeah, so do I. I love Michael too. I love Michael's spirit. So Rob says the Marxists I've encountered have a similar attitude to Doug Henwood, and he's an outright asshole. And the Marxists aren't all like Doug Henwood. So, Rob Rivera says, you think Bernie is going to pardon Edward Snowden and drop the charges against Assange? Yes, I think he will. And I think he's going to also do something for Chelsea Manning, as well. I think he's going to end the persecution of the whistleblowers all across the federal government. and that he will create a climate which is favorable to the whistleblowers and which protects the whistleblowers. I think that under Bernie, after a few years for people to get used to things, I'm not saying he's going to have to wait a few years to be pardoned, but I don't think he'll have to wait a few years. I think the most he may have to wait, okay, is just a couple of months. But after that time, he may have to wait for a few years before the honors start to flow. I think at some point, though, honors are going to start to flow from a Bernie administration because of the service that Edward Snowden has performed for the United States of America in revealing the spying by the federal government, okay, on all of our communications. That was a wonderful service that he provided for us all. I'll tell you something, okay, as well. There's no evidence, and there's never been any evidence, that one American intelligence agent has died because of what Snowden has done. But at the same time, if you weigh the value of the service against the possible lives that might be lost, okay, by doing such a thing, the intelligence that Snowden dropped on us is so vital for the recovery of a democratic society here in the United States, or perhaps for the first creation of a truly democratic society here in the United States, that I have to say, getting that intelligence is worth a good many lives. We have sacrificed far more lives for far less gain, and sometimes for no gain at all, or for negative outcomes entirely. Rob says AOC endorsement was the most important. Did you catch the clip when she broke the news of the endorsements? No, I haven't seen that yet, but I'll be watching it. Rob says, yes, Edward is a hero, but I honestly believe Julian's contributions far exceeding but Snowden's. I'm not sure that I can compare the two, but I'm sure the prosecutions against but Julian Assange will be dropped. And Rob says, yes, I can't forget Chelsea Manning. Yes, and neither can I. Okay, so I'm getting tired. I've been on for roughly 2 hours or so. Tulsi has said she would pardon them. I believe she would. I certainly do believe she would. She knows the value of what they've done for her major objective, which is to end the regime change wars. And she's right to want to end them. They are not things that we should be unilaterally doing. I'm not saying there's never a place for a regime change war, but I think it's a very extreme sort of thing, only justifiable in cases where there is an international criminal regime, such as the Nazis, which really must be defeated. And then to actually have such a war, you need to have a heavy majority of the world's nations involved, all pulling together to get rid of the evil that is that serious. Because it's going to cost so many lives to do it that everybody has to be together in being willing to sacrifice those lives. Robin says, "Thanks, Dr. Joe. I've shared, and sharing is caring." Thank you, Robin. Thank you very much. Good night. By the way, did that storm hit you in Northern Virginia? You mean tonight, Robin? Okay, I didn't notice anything. Okay, and even there was a good heavy rain today, early in the day, but I wouldn't consider it a storm. Evelina says, "Good program today. Thank you much. And thank you for coming." Evelina, thank you all for coming, and thank you all for sharing, and thank you all for staying with me for so long. I really appreciate it. Oh, also, please don't forget that in addition to sharing, when the YouTube comes out, please share, like, and subscribe. That it'll be coming out also very shortly. And please become a patron at www.patreon.com/Joe_Firestone. And good night. I will see you next time. Thank you again.